Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to the 12th General K.S. Thimayya Memorial Lecture. Before we begin, may I request you to stand for the rendition of the school song. Please be seated. Thanks to the General K.S. Thimayya Lecture, over the past few years, we've been witness to some of the finest manifestations of the immense potential that we know is ubiquitous with Cottonians. A couple of years ago, Lieutenant General K. Surendranath took to this stage with his Confessions of an Indian Army General. Last year, Dr. Rohan Murthy and Dr. Rahul Rao spoke from scientific and political schools of thought. We can all agree that their views served both as a testament to the education that they received from Cottons and as an inspiration to the Cottonians who listened to them. So, continuing along the tradition of having eminent and distinguished Cottonians address their mentors, contemporaries, and juniors, I take great pleasure in welcoming you to the General K.S. Thimayya Memorial Lecture and introducing its speakers, Dr. MANDYAM Srinivasan from the University of Queensland, Australia, and Reverend Dr. JAYAKIRAN Sebastian of the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. Please give them a hand. I would like to extend a very warm welcome on behalf of the entire Cottonian family to Ms. Mirayu Chengappa, the daughter of General K.S. Thimayya. She's accompanied today by her husband, General K.M. Chengappa, and their son, Mr. K.C. Berryappa, who's naturally a Cottonian, along with his wife, Mrs. Nicole Berryappa. We are truly honored to play host to members of General Thimayya's illustrious family, and we're touched by their presence here today. I would also like to extend our greetings to the patrons of the General Thimayya Memorial Lecture, General S.K. Jaitley and Air Marshal Osman, and all the other old Cottonians who've made it a point to return to their alma mater, as also all veterans, former and present members of staff, and guests in attendance. On to our speakers for today. Dr. MANDYAM Srinivasan and Reverend JAYAKIRAN Sebastian belong to the 1962 and the 1974 batches of Cottons, respectively. Dr. Srinivasan, who belonged to Pope House, is an exponent of neuroscience whose research focuses on the principles of visual processing, perception, and cognition in simple natural systems, and interestingly, on the application of these principles to machine vision and robotics. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation, and a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences for the Developing World. Following his graduation from Cottons, Dr. Srinivasan obtained an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from the Bangalore University, a master's degree in electronics from the Indian Institute of Science, a PhD in engineering and applied science from Yale University, a doctorate of science in neuroethology from the Australian National University, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich. Dr. Srinivasan is known for his research on how simple animal systems display complex behavior and how this behavior can be applied in robotics, especially in unmanned aerial vehicles. Among his numerous awards are the 2006 Australia Prime Minister's Science Prize, the 2008 UK Rank Prize for Optoelectronics, the 2009 Distinguished Alumni Award for the Indian Institute of Science, a membership of the Australia Ordo. In 2012, the Harold Spencer Jones Medal of the Royal Institute of Navigation in 2014, and many others. Dr. Srinivasan, Cottons is more than delighted to open its doors back to you. Reverend Dr. JAYAKIRAN Sebastian is a presbyter of the Church of South India and currently Dean, H. George Anderson Professor of Mission and Culture, and Director of the Multicultural Mission Resource Center at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. After graduating from Cottons in 1974, he obtained his Bachelor of Science degree from the St. Joseph's College of Arts and Science, his Bachelor of Divinity degree from the United Theological College, his Master of Theology from the Federated Faculty for Research in Religion and Culture, his Doctor of Theology from the University of Hamburg, from where he graduated magna cum laude. He has been professor in the Department of Theology and Ethics at the United Theological College in Bangalore, where he has served as the chairperson of the department and also the Dean of the Doctoral Studies at the college. He's a member of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton and has published several articles covering a range of interests, including the contributions and the ongoing relevance of the early teachers of faith, the conversion and baptism debate, and many other themes. A member of the North American Patristic Society, the International Association of Patristic Studies, the International Association of Mission Studies, the Associate Editor of the Journal of Mission Studies, a member of the Global Network for Public Theology, and a proud member of Pakenham Walsh House. Dr. Sebastian, we're honored to have you in our midst. Now, it was Einstein who once said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. This quote of his touches upon the theme of this year's lecture, the world through the prism of science and religion, perspectives, possibilities, and promises. Given the pedigree, the experience, and the levels of familiarity of our speakers, both with the subject and with their audience, there would have been no one more appropriate than Dr. Srinivasan and Dr. Sebastian to provide a holistic perspective of the theme. We look forward to hearing from them. Gentlemen, welcome back to Cottons. I would now like to hand over the proceedings to Mr. Aditya Sondhi.
Thank you, Paddy. And I know that's what your friends call you. William Prager was the school captain in General Thimayya's batch of 1922. He came back to teach at school, and I'm sure he would have been proud of what Captain Padmanabhan has done today. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trust, C.N. Kumar, Rajiv, Prashant, Ashwin, and Lokesh, I take pleasure in announcing the General K.S. Thimayya Medal for 2016. Please take a look. Nihar Amin is the first swimming coach to have been bestowed the prestigious Dronacharya Award. You saw a picture of him receiving this recognition for a lifetime of achievement from President Pranab Mukherjee, which was in 2015. He has identified and coached Olympians and Asian Games and Commonwealth Games medalists since 1992, including India's first ever swimming medal in the Commonwealth Games of 2010. 4 of his awards have been Arjuna awardees themselves. Nihar was India's coach at the Athens and Beijing Olympic Games in 2004 and 2008, and at various other international championships. He is a Level 4 certified coach by the American Swim Coaches Association, as also certified by the International Swimming Federation, FINA. He has held elite coaching positions in the US and was in fact assistant to Jack Nelson when their ward Joel Thomas won gold in the 4x100 freestyle relay at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, as did their ward Sheila Taromina in the 4x200 freestyle at Atlanta in 1996. Nihar has also worked with several other Olympians from Finland and Brazil. His coaching positions in India are equally impressive, and his swimmers have won over a mind-boggling 650 national gold medals and broken no less than 134 national records at both the junior and senior levels. Closer home in Bangalore, he has served with the K.C. Reddy Swim Center, Dolphin Aquatics, and the evergreen Baswangudi Aquatic Center. He is a core committee member of the Go Sports Foundation and has been responsible for Search Level 2 coaching manuals, which are now formally accepted by the World Swimming Coaches Association as part of its curriculum. He is indeed a fitting recipient of the Karnataka Olympic Association Lifetime Achievement Award. We are, of course, proud that Nihar is an old Cottonian, as was his late father, Mr. Amin Shakur, and as is his brother, Shiraz. He belongs to the batch of 1978 and went to Pettigrew. Nihar, you will be happy to know that most of the swimmers in school in our time were pretty much the state swimming team as well. We acknowledge the presence of Nihar's mother and his sister, Shehnaz, who herself is an accomplished swimmer. Ladies and gentlemen, please show your appreciation for Mr. Nihar Amin. To receive the General Thimayya Medal, Nihar, may I please request you to come on stage, and could I request General Jaitley to please do us the honors.
Good morning, everyone. I'm extremely humbled and honored to be back to my alma mater. It's been a while since I've been back to Bishop Cotton's, and all of us here owe possibly everything that we have grown up to be to our school. This is an incredible honor for me to receive this medal, and I would like to spend a few minutes and share my experiences with you and use this as an opportunity to help Indian sport along a little bit, because school sport is a huge potential for putting Indian sport on the map. If you would notice, we have far too few participants on the world stage in terms of our athletes. And the school systems and the universities are not yet tapped to their full potential. A very good example would be the United States, where you find the NCAAs and you find the universities supporting and the schools supporting sport completely. This is not the case in India at this point in time. And I think the way forward would be if we were to inculcate high performance sport and improve the standard of school sport to the level of the other countries. And I think that would be a huge fillip to Indian sport, and that's really the way forward. I have an academy here and in Bangalore, and we coach over 300 of the best swimmers in the country. But I think if we get all the schools in the country involved and we use them as a feeding system into the top high-performance academies, Indian sport would be at a much higher level than it is today. And I look forward to working with schools, in particular Cotton's, and if anybody would be interested, I think it would be really helpful for everyone. So anyway, thank you so much for this wonderful award. I'm extremely humbled, and thank you for inviting me back to school. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nihar. And I think you've made Professor Zachariah an offer he can't refuse. On behalf of the Trust, we have been recognizing former members of the staff with a certificate and a check for ₹1 lakh on behalf of the General Thimayya Benevolent Fund. Our first donee this year was Dr. Arthur Wilson, our Hindi master from 1981 to 1996. We reached out to him in July, but sadly lost him shortly thereafter. He will be missed. We have 4 other beneficiaries this year. May I please invite our patron, Air Marshal Osman, to come on stage to felicitate our beloved retired staff. Our first beneficiary, an erudite Hindi teacher and a scoutmaster who worked with the school for 20 years from 1968, Mr. P.K. Guru Rao. hardworking member of the Bursar's office staff from 1971 to 1988, Mr. Narayan Gowda. An integral part of the science lab and later with the administrative office, having served the school for a full 32 years, Mr. Shamrao Kulkarni. Many of you will remember his brother, the late Mr. Venkatrao Kulkarni, who was class teacher of 6A and taught at Cottons for close to 40 years. We also have in our midst Mrs. Gyana Jacob, whose late husband, Mr. Jacob Chamberlain, was a part of our transport staff for 23 years. He passed away some years ago, but we fondly remember him today. He drove us to our inter-school matches and was our talisman in many ways. Mrs. Gyana Jacob. Thank you, Marshal Osman. And we thank our beneficiaries for being with us today and their families as well. And from the old Cottonian community, on behalf of the Trust, may I say we welcome suggestions of names of retired staff, teaching and non-teaching, who we could recognize in the days ahead. Before we move on to the oration for today, I feel it incumbent to show you what our speaker, Reverend Kiran Sebastian, looked like in school. Here he is, in uniform with his Pakenham Walsh house flash. His parents, Mrs. Hannah Sebastian and Professor David Sebastian, taught at the school for many, many years and were much loved for their service. You find him here in their safe custody. Mrs. Sebastian, in fact, was our house mistress for many years. Kiran's son, Neeraj, too, is an old boy. And of course, we must equally embarrass Srini. So here he is as part of the class of 1962. And here, as a prefect, with Reverend I.L. Thomas. And here he is now. The B-man and the Third Order of Australia to be speaking at these lectures. As the blurb on the invitation said, science and religion define life differently, but they perhaps have common ground and promises too for the future. We're ready to hear from our speakers on this delectable theme. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. MANDYAM Srinivasan.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you, Paddy, for that very kind and totally undeserved introduction. It is a great honor to be giving this lecture here today, and I thank the Board of Trustees and the principal of the school for making this possible. It's a great honor and a great pleasure. Thank you very much. A little bit about my own background. I'm just a slightly confused electrical engineer. So I started off my life by studying electrical engineering, and pretty soon it occurred to me that, well, I had a bit of a midlife crisis, early, premature midlife crisis, and it seemed to me that I didn't want to do the standard electrical engineering that's normally done. I wanted to do something slightly different. So I got interested in sort of biology and trying to see whether, as an electrical engineer, I could model mathematically the behavior of animals and learn to characterize them in interesting ways. And on the other hand, to draw inspirations from biology, from the behavior of animals, to try and see if we could build better engineering systems. So it's kind of a two-way process, and that's what I'd like to sort of talk to you about today. So if you look at a honeybee will, I study small creatures like honeybees and more recently birds. You imagine a honeybee, you see a honeybee, it'll set out from its hive, it'll make a meandering search for food, it might travel up to 10 kilometers before it finds the food, and then when it finds the food, it'll make a straight line, literally a beeline, back home. So it knows exactly how far it's flown, what direction it's flown, comes back home, makes a beautiful smooth landing at the entrance to this hive, to the hive of the bee. All of this is being done with a brain that's about the size of a sesame seed. and a brain that has far fewer neurons than our own brains. So what makes these animals, insects, tick, and tick so well? Did they use any special tricks to vision and navigation that we could learn about as curious scientists? That is one of the missions of our lab. The other thing is, if we do find something clever and intelligent and unexpected that these small creatures do, small, simple creatures, can we copy some of these ideas to build better vision systems to help aircraft guide themselves autonomously without the aid of GPS or any of the standard devices? Those are the sort of aims of our lab. The third sort of aim is, what about the perceptual and cognitive capacities of creatures with small brains? An insect, of course, can learn things, but when it learns things, does it learn things in a fairly rigid and stereotyped way, or can it be flexible about the things that it learns? Can it learn, for example, something in one context and apply it to a completely different context? Can you teach an old bee new tricks, for example? That's the kind of thing we'd like to also explore in this talk. So, as I said, we'd also like to look at, more recently we've been looking at birds. This is an Australian parrot called the budgerigar, which some of you might have as pets. Very iconic Australian bird, very easy to train. Now, our lab has an interesting mix of biologists on the one hand and engineers on the other hand. So there's a biologist doing experiments with animals, and they inspire the engineers who build vision systems based on what they learn from the biologists. So it's a nice marriage of two quite different fields that sort of coexist without fighting, for example. It's a lovely, lovely environment in which to work, and it's a delight. Now, a little bit about insect vision. Insects have compound eyes, as many of you may know. Each one of these, the right eye and the left eye, consists of many, many small facets. Each one consists of a small lens that focuses light onto a small group of light-sensitive photoreceptors, typically between 6 and 9. And in fact, these photoreceptors have 3 different spectral sensitivities. So there are a group of receptors that are sensitive to ultraviolet light, so another group that's sensitive to green light, another group that's sensitive to blue light. So these animals have color vision, beautiful trichromatic color vision, just the way we do, all right? So each one of these little facets is looking in a small cone of space about 2 degrees across, and each facet is looking in a slightly different direction. And so this right-hand compound eye has about 5,000 facets. That covers the entire right visual hemisphere of the insect, the right visual world, I would say, and the left compound eye covers the other half. So the insect has panoramic vision that's endowed by all of these sort of multiple facets. So each facet, again, is doing color analysis as well. So you can think of the way the insect captures the image of the world is something like pointillistic representation of the world by a pointillistic artist, right? So and it's a panoramic pointillistic representation. So that's how insect vision works. Now, that may seem a little bit different from the way our own eye works, because our eye has just a single lens that focuses light onto a retina in the back. It's more like a camera eye, right? That's different, of course. The optics is different between us and insects. But that by itself is no big deal. It's not of any great consequence, this difference. It's only an optical difference. The main difference that comes about is the fact that the 2 eyes of an insect are actually very close together. So stereo vision becomes very difficult if you're an insect. Now, the reason why stereo works well in our case is that the 2 eyes are fairly far apart, I think about 8 centimeters apart. So if I look at my finger with one eye and then with the other eye, you can try it yourself if you like, you will find that the image of the finger actually shifts from one image to the other image. It moves back and forth. So what your brain is doing is it's measuring that amount of shift, or disparity as it's called, and working out by triangulation how far away my finger is, right? So that's what the brain is doing when it's using stereo vision to work out how far away different objects are. That's how our depth vision comes about, right? Now, the problem with an insect is that it's handicapped because the 2 eyes are very close together. So as I move these eyes closer and closer together, that shift becomes smaller and smaller, you see? Virtually, it becomes like 2 identical images, the 2 eyes, because they're so close together. So stereo vision becomes very difficult. There aren't any cues in these 2 images to really extract depth information reliably, right? So insects have to cope with the world in a completely different way to get depth information or range information. And they do this in a much more active way by moving in the world. The idea is very simple. Let's say I'm flying along in a straight line, or let's say driving along a highway. I notice that the trees which are close to me, lining the highway, whizzed by my visual field very rapidly, and this high speed of image motion tells me that these objects are actually very close to me, right? On the other hand, something is very far away, like a distant hill, or the clouds in the sky, or the sun. The images of those objects move very slowly in my eye, or not at all, and that slowness of image motion tells me that those objects are actually very far away. Okay, so insects have actually learned or evolved to translate image speed into object range. Now, in order to do this, they actually have to be physically moving all the time. The moment they stop moving, they cannot gauge the information, the world becomes a two-dimensional world. So it's a very active way of perceiving the world in 3 dimensions. You have to interact with it as you go along to glean information about the structure of the world. That's how they do it. Now, how does this come about? How do we get these amazing insights? How does it actually come to be? Well, okay, let's begin our little story. Now, has anyone ever trained bees here? Probably not. Well, I do. I train bees for a living. I don't get paid very well, but it's a lot of fun. So here, actually, this is Dr. Miriam Lehrer. I spent 4 years as a young faculty member at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and she was the one who taught me all about how to train bees. She's a master of this thing. So here she is, starting to do a training experiment with bees in the morning. So it's a very simple thing. You can do it in your own backyard if you like. You set out a sugar water feeder. You take some tissue paper, put it onto a saucer, take a sugar water bottle, invert it over this, and the sugar water gradually seeps out through the rims. Pretty soon, a bee will come, discover it, have a taste, and says, wow, this looks very good. I better go back to my nest and tell my other folks about it. And the bee does a little dance, which we'll talk about later. And so that it recruits other bees to this hive. To the feeder, I should say, sorry. And then once you've got a bunch of feeders coming in there, you can actually mark them, individually color code them, and keep track of which bee is which, because bees, like students, are quite individually different. Some bees can learn well, others not so well. Some bees can be obedient, other bees not so obedient. They're just like school children. So you can keep track of individual performance. So if you're doing a learning experiment or training experiment, you can keep track of individual bees this way. Okay, now, once this happens, of course, we take this feeder and move it step by step into the lab, and the bees will follow, because the food is good, they'll follow you, and then you can train them to fly inside your experimental setup. Fairly easy. The only slight problem is that if the food source is very good, you have a very big exponential buildup of bees visiting the feeder, because, and you don't want all the feeders in the hive to be visiting you, because that's about 40,000 bees in the hive. That's not a good idea, right? So the way you manage this is once you've got this feeder inside your lab, you place a decoy, a weak sugar solution feeder outside in the balcony there. And the new recruits come there and land on this decoy, which is the most obvious source there, target, and they have a look at this sugar solution and taste it and say, this is a false alarm. Someone's made a mistake. This is not as good as it was advertised to be. So they get disappointed and they don't come back again. So it's only the bees that know the secret of where the good stuff is. They keep coming again and again because they know where the good food sources, and that's inside the lab, right? So that's how we start an experiment. Very easy. Any of you can do it in your backyard. You don't even need your own hive. You can use a neighbor's hive. The neighbor probably won't even know. It's only half a dozen bees. It won't affect his honey production. Everything's fine. Okay, back to our experiment now. Now, again, this is a chance sort of observation that happens. Quite often you do these experiments in science, you don't do it with the intention of actually asking a question. There's an accidental observation, serendipity that happens, and that takes you on a different track. And usually some of the most interesting and best discoveries come purely out of chance. They're not planned at all. So this is what happened. We were training bees to fly into the lab through a hole in the window. And we noticed that the bees were flying fairly precisely through the middle of the hole. And we asked ourselves, how are they doing this? How are they measuring the distances to either rim and staying in the middle, balancing the distances? They don't have stereo, as we mentioned. And even if we have stereo, even if they had stereo, they couldn't really do a good job in this case because, you see, the right-hand side rim is being viewed only by the right eye, and the left rim is being viewed only by the left eye. So even if they had stereo, they couldn't really use it to solve this particular problem of flying down the middle. So how did they do this? Well, maybe they're using something far simpler, which is as they fly through the hole, they make sure that the speed of the image of this rim is equal to the speed of the image of this rim. If both the rims are moving past the two eyes at the same speed, it means I'm flying right down the middle, right? If one rim appears to be moving faster, I know I'm flying closer to that rim, and I move away from that rim to balance the thing, right? Does that make sense? A very simple idea, right? Well, how do you ask the bee if this is what it's doing? You cannot have a conversation with a bee, right? So part of the interesting aspect of our work and a challenge is to devise an experiment that tells us the answer. So here's what we do. We train bees to fly into the lab and fly through a tunnel like this, a corridor, where the inside of the tunnel is lined with a visual pattern, in this case vertical black and white stripes. And they come and visit a sugar water feeder here, and they fly back again to the hive. So they come back and forth again and again. And we film their flight trajectories from above using a video camera, and we analyze the trajectories as they go. So if you reconstruct these trajectories after you analyze them, here's what you find. The bees fly almost directly down the middle. Dextrosum, next to dextrosum, right down the middle. However, if you take one of these walls now, these walls are mounted on conveyor belts, and you move them in the move the wall in the same direction as the incoming bee, you find the bee flies a lot closer to the moving wall. Now what's happening here is because the bee and the wall are moving in the same direction, the image speed as seen by the left eye is much lower than the image speed seen by the right eye. So the bee thinks the left wall is much further away, so she moves away from that wall to compensate. Oh, sorry, she moves closer to that wall. She moves closer to that wall to compensate, right? Now, so that's what's happening here. The bee is flying a lot closer to the moving wall. On the other hand, if you move this wall in the opposite direction to the bee's incoming flight, then the bee flies further away from that moving wall, because in this case, the wall is moving in one direction, the bee is moving in the other direction. The image speed as seen by that eye is very high, so the bee says, whoa, there's something dangerously close on this side, I better move away from this side to compensate, right? So this simple experiment tells us that bees really fly through narrow passages simply by balancing the optic flow, the image motion in the two eyes, and it's a very simple way to do navigation. In fact, after we published this paper, a number of robotics engineers started to build robots that navigate down corridors using the same principle, balancing the optic flow. Now, after this experiment was published, people also studied human beings walking down corridors. And they set up a virtual reality scenario where a person walks on a treadmill, and the person is given a virtual simulation, a reality simulation of walking down a corridor. And when you manipulate the apparent motion of the movements of the two walls, sure enough, the human being also veers to one side or the other, depending upon which way you move these walls. So even we, humans, even though we're not aware of it, we do it subconsciously or unconsciously. We take stock or take account of the motion of the walls to steer safely down the middle. Now, what about birds? So my student Partha did his PhD some few years ago, and he was interested in birds, and we started to look at birds and see what birds do when they navigate down corridors. Now, this is a view of birds flying down a corridor. It's a top view. So these are now budgerigars. If you watch them flying down a corridor like this, where both sides have vertical stripes, you find the bird flies fairly precisely down the middle of the corridor. However, if you change this situation, now we have vertical stripes on one side and horizontal stripes on the other side. You find the bird flies a lot closer to the wall that carries the horizontal stripes. Now, we think the reason why this is happening is because the horizontal striped wall produces almost no image motion, because you're moving parallel to the stripes, so nothing changes in that eye, right? So it's as though that wall is infinitely far away because nothing appears to move, so the bird is moving closer to that wall, assuming that there's no danger. On the other side, you have vertical stripes which are moving, create a strong impression of motion, so that's something to be avoided, so they steer away from that wall. So the same idea of balancing the image motion of the two eyes is happening in birds as well. So birds, bees, and humans seem to use the same principle to navigate through narrow gaps. Now, this next one, this is where we need the sound, is a BBC clip of a predatory bird. It's known as a goshawk that flies through a forest. It's been trained to fly through a very dense, thick forest to the other end to find a piece of meat that it likes, of course. So it's trained to fly through this and it flies through it amazingly fast and without any collisions. So this is, what they've done is they mounted a camera on top of the head of the bird, and what you see is the view, the bird's eye view of the flight through the forest.
And finally, the goshawk, the master of maneuverability, solving the ultimate challenge, flying through woodland.
This is in real time, by the way. It's not speeded up. It's the exact real time.
It feels for the air like an eagle, swings its wings like a falcon, and all the time just inches from the ground and a breath away from collision with a tree. Split-second timing, the envy of any fighter pilot.
So clearly, these birds are able to maneuver and plan their flights amazingly precisely to avoid collisions with these numerous tree trunks that are there in the way, right? How do they do it? They don't even seem to slow down. They're just shooting through. So we really don't know the answer, but we're making very small steps, taking very small steps, so trying to understand some of the basic ideas about this in the following experiment. So this is now my postdoc Ingo Schiffner, now looking at budgerigars flying through very narrow gaps. So here's an overhead view of a budgerigar flying through a narrow gap. So these birds are actually very good, it turns out, at estimating the width of the gap through which they have to fly. They will close their wings if and only if the width of the gap is slightly less than their wingspan, about 1 centimeter less. If it's about the same as the width as the wingspan or larger, they will fly through uninterrupted. So they have very good body awareness, as we say. And they know when to close their wings and when it's not necessary. Human beings are apparently much more conservative. So if you do an experiment with a human being, you show the person a doorway and say, do you think you can go through it frontally, or do you need to turn sideways? We give ourselves a 30% safety margin. We are much more conservative, but birds are very precise. And probably the reason for that is that, the moment they stop flying, they lose flight control. They lose control authority. They become like a stone. They're purely under the influence of gravity. They have no control. It's dangerous. So they try to minimize the need to stop flying as far as possible. Not only that, okay, here's just a view of a bird flying through a wide passage, another one flying through a narrow passage, and that's what happens. And not only that, and don't worry about the details of this style, I'll tell you what it implies. Individual birds, of course, have different wingspans in our group of 12 birds that we study, and each one is individually aware of its own wingspan. So they don't have a general wingspan for a budgerigar. Each one seems to know exactly what its thing is. And how does it come to know that? It's something we're looking at now. One way to do it, a slightly cruel way, would be to trim its wings and see if it adapts to the new wingspan, or slightly extend the wings and see if it readjusts and learns a new wingspan. That's something we're planning on. Not only that, now the birds that decide they need to close their wingspan because the aperture is too narrow will actually, way ahead of time, compensate for the wing closure by raising their flight altitude, because they know in advance that later on they're going to have to close their wings and lose altitude. So there's a lot of elaborate, sophisticated pre-planning that goes on amongst these birds. And if you try to insult someone by saying he has a bird brain, you're actually paying him a compliment. They're actually much smarter than we thought. So there's a lot of elaborate pre-planning that's going on, obviously with that goshawk. There's a lot of it that's going on there that we're just starting to learn in a very basic way. More recently, we've been looking at how birds avoid mid-air collisions by flying birds across each other in a narrow tunnel. And we find that most of the time, about 85% of the time, each bird, as it sees a head-on collision, it veers to its right. So you see, if one bird veered to its right and the other bird veered to its left, that would not help the situation, right? I mean, how often do you have a situation where you walk along a sidewalk, you encounter somebody, you go right, he goes left, you go like this, then you go like that, and back and forth, and it's very awkward, right? Well, birds seem to have a nice general rule, which is if you have a head-on encounter, each bird turns to its right, and that seems to be the thing that works. And curiously enough, I'm sure we have some pilots here. Pilots are told if they see an imminent head-on collision, each pilot is instructed to turn to his right or her right. This is something that birds have evolved many, many, many years ago. So it's obviously been there for a long time. Now, let's turn to landing. Now, landing is quite a challenge, and this is why people pay airline pilots so much. As you come into land, you've got to make sure that you slow down, you decelerate appropriately, so that when you come close to the ground, you're flying with almost 0 speed, so you don't hurt yourself when you touch down. Also, you've got to make sure you don't decelerate too rapidly, because then you come to a hover above the ground. Then what do? That's embarrassing. That's not cool. You've got to do something about it. You've got to precisely orchestrate this thing in a very nice way, a coordinated way. So how do they do that? Very simple, it turned out. We train bees to come and find a wad of sugar water, as you see here in the green box. I can't seem to see my cursor. Yeah, where's my cursor going? Anyway, down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And we filmed them as they came into land. And it turned out that if you look at the speed of and you reconstruct the flight trajectories, what you find is that when they're flying high, they're flying fast. When they're flying low, they're flying slow. In fact, the speed of flight turns out to be directly proportional to the height above the surface. And what this is telling us is that they're actually controlling their flight speed as they approach the ground by keeping the image speed of the ground constant as they're coming towards the ground. Now, if they do that, then automatically they will slow down as they get closer and closer to the ground, and finally when they touch down, they'll be moving almost 0 speed. So it's a very nice biological autopilot that allows you to do a smooth landing. And what's nice about this thing is that you don't even need to know with this method how far away the ground is or how rapidly you're approaching it. All you have to do is to make sure as you're approaching the ground, you keep the image speed of the ground constant, and you will automatically slow down as you approach it. Now, if you sit in an aeroplane in a window seat and look at the ground on the side as the pilot is coming into land, as you get closer and closer to the ground will appear to move faster and faster, right? But that's because the pilot is not slowing down. The bee does not allow that to happen. The bee keeps the image speed of the ground constant as coming into land, and by doing so, it automatically slows down. So it's a beautiful autopilot that does not need any laser beams or radar or any other kind of rangefinder. It just needs a video camera to be put on your aircraft, if you're doing this in your aircraft, to make a very smooth landing at very low cost and without emitting any radiation, because that's something very important to the Air Force and armed services, because the moment you emit any radiation, you reveal yourself to the enemy. That stealth element is lost. So video using passive vision is a very good solution for that. Okay, now bees, as I told you, will fly long distances and come back and tell their housemates, nestmates, how far away the food source is, and in what direction to fly to get to the food source. And this is done through the so-called waggle dance, which many of you may know. It was decoded and interpreted by the late Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize for distinguishing this, decoding the meaning of this dance. So here's a bee. This is the marked bee that's dancing. It's come back from a good food source, and it's telling the other bees where this food source is. And you see it does these alternating left and right hand loops, and every time it's finished a loop, it waggles its abdomen from side to side, and this is known as the waggle phase. And this waggle phase is very important. That contains information about how far away the food source is and the direction in which to fly to the food source. Now, the longer the duration of the waggle, the further away the food source is. Okay, so distance and the direction is transmitted in terms of the direction of the axis of this waggle. Whoops. So the waggle axis is pointed, I don't know why it's moving so slowly now, it's a bit jerky, but that's the direction along which the waggle happens. So that's about 45 degrees to the vertical, clockwise. So it's telling the other bees you've got to fly at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the sun to get to the food source. So the position of the food source is being indicated in terms of distance and direction. So it's in polar coordinates if you're a mathematician. That's how it's a very symbolic language that the bees have evolved to communicate this information between each other. Now, by the way, I would say that this particular dance is telling the other bees the food source is about 500 meters away. So even a human being can actually read the dance and predict where the bee is actually going to go after it's unloaded its food Now, the dance is a wonderful device by which you can actually look at the mechanism by which bees actually work out how far they have flown. Because they have to come back and do this dance to tell the other bees how far the food source is, right? So how does the bee's odometer, like you have in a car, how does the bee's odometer work? Now, you can fly bees in constrained environments like we do in our labs, and I won't go into all the details, but the dance gives you a wonderful way of, you can put these bees into various circumstances in the lab, and the dance gives you a wonderful way of reading out the bee's perception of how far it thinks it's traveled. And I won't go into the details of all of this because not enough time, but we've been able to work out that the way in which the bee's odometer works is it measures how much the image of the world has moved past in its eyes on the way from the hive to the food source, and uses that measure of image motion to work out how far it's flown. So it's not measuring energy consumption, it's not measuring the number of wing beats, it's not measuring the flight time, it's looking at how much the world has moved in its eye and using that as an indication of how far where the food source is. And this is a very useful way to do odometry, distance measurement, and this is something we're putting into our aircraft as well, as I will show you later. Okay, now let's turn briefly to the cognitive aspects of bee vision. How cognitive are bees? How clever are bees? How smart are they? Well, people have studied rats, chimpanzees, and humans, of course, and their capacity to navigate through complex labyrinths. But what can a bee do? Can a bee do something similar? So we started this by trying to see if you could train bees to fly through a complex labyrinth like this. There's the food reward at the very end. So the bee takes the right route towards this labyrinth, and some of them have more than one exit. These are chambers, individual chambers. Some of them at one exit and some of them more than one exit. If it learns the right route, it can find the reward. Now, we started by making things fairly easy for the bee. We train it to follow a series of green marks, green labels, that indicate the right exit or the right path to the reward. So the way we do it is we have trained bees to come to a feeder. The feeder itself has a green label there. So the bee learns to associate the green label with the food. So it learns to follow that label. So we can move the feeder step by step from one box to the other, and the bees will follow. And eventually, you don't need to take it through the entire maze. You can take the feeder through the first 2 or 3 boxes, and by that time, they've got the hang of it. They've learned the rule of the game. The name of the game is to actually follow the green tag, and then you can take away the feeder and put it at the very end over there, and the bees will fly right through this thing. So the next video shows you an example of a trained bee flying through one of these mazes. Now this happens fairly fast, so you'll have to follow it fairly carefully. Here we go. Oh. There she is. Green label, green label, green label, there we are, that's the reward. So within half a day, bees can learn to do this. And once they've learned this task, you can take them through any maze by simply changing the orientation of the pattern of the marks, so they will follow anything. You can even make them go round and round in a labyrinth if you want, but that would be very cruel. We would never do that, obviously. So now here's a slightly more symbolic representation of the route through the maze. Here what's happening is that the bee doesn't just simply follow a mark. It goes into each chamber, and the back wall of each chamber has a color. That color can either be blue or yellow, and the rule is if the color is blue, you have to turn right. If the color is yellow, you have to turn left. So it's a symbolic signpost, and the question is, can bees learn symbolic signposts? And sure enough, they can. Don't worry about the histogram to the right. They seem to learn this task just as well as the simple, dumb following of a mark. So they're quite good at learning symbolic rules as well, which is quite interesting and surprising. All this is being done, of course, in a very small creature with a very simple brain. And then, of course, this is the ultimate sort of challenge, an unmarked maze altogether. There's no marks telling them where to go. The bees just have to figure it out for themselves by trial and error, flying through different routes. And they learn that too, not as well as the other cases, but it's much better, so definitely significantly better than chance. They learn that. And of course, which is nice to know, they can learn a complicated maze. But what is interesting is that it's only in this case that the bees actually learn the route through the maze. In the other 2 cases where they had these hints or guiding marks, they never learned the route. So it's just a little bit like, let's say you're driving and your passenger is doing the navigating. You never learn the route, do you? It's only when you're forced to learn the route that you actually learn it. So bees in that way are actually remarkably human, right? Not very different from us at all. Okay, now here's an image. Now, some of you may have seen this image before, but for those of you who haven't seen this, what do you see? You probably see the young lady here. You might see the birds. You'll see the mountains and the hills. If you could look a little more carefully and closely, you might see the two fingers here, the hands and the fingers. You might see the flute, and you might finally see the face. So there are all these camouflaged objects there. And what is amazing about this is that once you've seen this image, you'll never look at it in the same way again. 10 years later, someone can show you this image, and immediately you'll see all of these hidden objects. You don't need time anymore to search and find them. So we humans have this thing called top-down processing, which knows, when it knows what to look for, it reaches out there, and even if the signal is buried in a lot of noise, it managed to extract the signal and pull out the relevant objects. Now we wondered whether lowly creatures like bees also have something akin to top-down processing. So here's the experiment. We show them camouflaged objects. This is now a textured ring presented against a randomly textured background. This is a textured circle, a disk, presented against a randomly textured background. Now, these objects are actually slightly in front of the background, so if the bee comes towards it and moves from side to side, the motion of the object will appear to be slightly bigger than the motion of the background, so it can actually see the object by means of motion parallax, as I say. But, try as we might, you cannot train the bees to distinguish between these two objects. I mean, we train them by actually rewarding them when they pick the correct object. They get a reward of food, water. If they pick the wrong object, they don't get any food. So anyway, you can try for 5 days, which is a long time, to try to train the bees to make this discrimination. They simply cannot. However, if you begin by training them on uncamouflaged versions of the same patterns, this is now a black ring against a white background, a black disk against a white background, they will learn that. And then when you present them the camouflaged versions, they'll spot it immediately without any training. So clearly, when you give the bees a hint as to what to expect, they will go, aha, this is the hint. Not only that, now you can give them new camouflage objects. This is now a horizontal bar and a vertical bar, and you don't need to pre-train them on the uncamouflaged versions. You can directly give them the camouflaged versions. They've learned the trick of how to break the camouflage, right? So they know that by moving from side to side, they can pick up the motion parallax that makes these objects pop out, and that's the cue that they get, and they can do it. Now, what I mean by motion parallax is the following. If I look at this, you probably won't see anything, but if I move one object relative to the other, the elephant pops out of the jungle. So I can either move the elephant or I can move the jungle. You have the same effect. So relative motion is something that lots of animals, insects use to make objects pop out against the background. For example, if you're flying with a bunch of trees there, you want to see individual trees, you can see them by virtue of this thing popping out. Different trees at different distances pop out and reveal themselves. Now, here, associative recall. Now, when I look at this, invariably smell lemon or orange. Does that work for you? It certainly works for me. Associative recall is a very powerful phenomenon that many of us possess. For example, if you listen to a piece of music what first appeared when you were a school child, it might remind you of things you were doing a long time ago, right? Or if you get a whiff of perfume or cologne, it might remind you of a boyfriend or a girlfriend that you had many, many years ago, but you don't want to talk about anymore. Associative recall is a very powerful phenomenon we all have, and we're wondering whether even lowly creatures like bees possess associative recall. So here's the experiment. We're trying to see whether bees can learn to associate the scent of a food and associate the location of where that food source was based on scent memory. So what we do is we train bees to come from a hive, fly from a hive to a feeder that's placed at a particular location here, and this feeder is laced, for example, with the scent of rose. So the bees are individually marked and trained to visit that feeder for a day or two, and then you take away that feeder and place a different feeder in a different location. Now this feeder is placed here, and it has a different scent. It has a scent of lemon. So the same bees are now being trained to visit that feeder for a couple of days, and then we go back and forth. Every time the feeder is placed over here, it has the scent of rose. Every time the feeder is placed over there, it has the scent of lemon. So the question is, will they learn to associate each one of these scents with a particular location of a feeder? Okay, so we train them for about a week. Then the weekend, we leave them alone to do whatever they want, so they can fly out and visit other food sources. Again, on Monday morning, we come back. It's early in the day. The bees have not started flying yet. It's quite cool. And we place 2 dummy feeders, one where the former rose feeder used to be, one where the former lemon feeder used to be. When I say dummy feeders, there's no sugar, there's no food, there's no scent. They're just 2 bottles, empty bottles, right? And what we do is we simply blow a scent into the hive entrance. There's no traffic yet, but the moment you blow rose scent, the marked bees emerge, and most of them look for the food where the former rose-scented food used to be. All right? Again, if you now blow lemon scent, the bees again come out, and this time they look to see where the lemon feeder used to be. So clearly the scent that they're experiencing is triggering recall of these food sources and helping expedite their journey to the food source. But remember, in the test, these feeders have no scent. They're not just following a scent. The scent is triggering a memory, right? Which is saying, aha, I know where that is. Amazing for a small creature like a bee. Now, what typically happens during a dance is that, this is another bee dancing. Now, in the middle of the dance, quite often the other bees will sort of headbutt this bee and stop it from dancing. And what they're doing is they're begging this bee to deliver samples of the nectar that is actually brought back from the food source. So it will regurgitate, it'll literally vomit some of the nectar that it's brought back, and the other bees will have a taste and then decide whether it's actually worthwhile to go there or not, right? So they're making these evaluations, value judgments. But what is nice is that, if they get a scent of the nectar as well, a bee that's been there before will say, aha, I know where that scent is. I don't really need this dance information. That could expedite the journey. It could augment my navigation. But it'll provide additional information that tells me exactly where the food source is. Now, if there's time, I'll be there for another 10 minutes. I'll just do the robotics part, which is the final part. It won't take very long. I'll switch to that. Yeah, thank you. Close this. Now, here's our effort in the area of biorobotics, as we call it, biologically inspired robotics. And the idea is to try and see if we can implement or test some of our ideas about what we think we understand about insect vision by putting it into aircraft. Now, our objective is not to be slavishly biomimetic and build a machine that looks like an insect, with the compound eyes and the flapping wings and so on. We just look at some of the basic principles that these insects have and see if we can implement them in standard, more or less standard, off-the-shelf, readily made, readily available hardware, and see if we can actually get these aircraft to behave the way insects behave. And who knows, maybe we'll find something that's interesting and useful for all sorts of unexpected applications. So here's a view of a honeybee compound eye. We see the two compound eyes there, and that's our electronic counterpart. We have 2 wide-angle cameras placed back to back, looking to either side, so each camera covers 1/2 of the field of view. Now, it turns out that insects, quite apart from these 2 compound eyes, they also possess these 3 little eyes called ocelli. These are more camera-like eyes, and they're 2 looking on each side, and they're scanning the horizon. And people think that what they're doing is they're looking at the level of the horizon on each side, and the level is the same on both sides. It means the insect is flying level. If this horizon goes down and that one goes up, it means the insect has rolled to the left, and vice versa, right? So they're monitoring the horizon and using that to stabilize the orientation or attitude of the insect as it's flying. Now, there's another ocellus in the front, and that's monitoring the horizon in the front. If the horizon goes down, it means the insect has pitched up. If it goes up, it means it's pitched down. So you can stabilize your pitch by looking at the horizon in front. So by looking all around you, you can estimate your instantaneous orientation and control it if you want to. So this is something that's far more reliable than using the standard gyroscopes that are put into aircraft. And here's a test of that system. That's the horizon profile there, shown in yellow. And this is the computed orientation of the aircraft. So that's showing you how the aircraft is turning. It'll also do a loop pretty soon, so that you can even track it's doing a loop. So all of the motions of the aircraft, the orientations can be tracked very rapidly and very reliably in real time. So now here is a test flight. This now shows you all of the features that we put into these aircraft to make them fly completely autonomously without the aid of GPS, by the way, because our challenge is to do everything the way an insect or a bird does without the aid of any external navigational sources or infrastructure like GPS. And this is why companies like Boeing are interested in funding us, because quite often they're concerned about what will happen if there's a GPS dropout. Can you manage it on your own? And then you really have to be managing like an animal, which has to use its own senses and not rely on anything external, right? So that's what we're doing. So here we go. This is a test flight that shows you features. So we're taking off. The vision system is front, in the front of the nose. That's the view from the two fisheye cameras. It's covering a panoramic view. See, that's the tail plane. That's the back of the plane that you're seeing in the far edge. The horizon profile is being monitored by looking at the shape of that horizon there. Height at very low height is being measured using stereo, and at very high heights you measure the optic flow and use that to gauge your height above the ground. You also measure the image motion of the ground to work out how far you've flown using odometry, the way the honeybee does. So you're not using GPS to track your motions, you're using the motion of the ground, purely relying on the motion of the ground as sensed by your video cameras. And those yellow circles that are being dropped there are virtual circles signifying 25 meters of forward progress on the ground. All right, they're not actually real circles, they're just internal to the visualization. So it's keeping track of how far it's flown. And now we're about to come in to do an automatic landing, completely automatic landing, nobody controlling it. Yeah, so, whoops. Now this one is nearly the final slide. This one now is a completely autonomous mission now, and the challenge here is for us to take off, tell the aircraft to take off from the ground, go a certain distance, go up to a certain altitude, and then turn back and come back and land entirely on its own. But even to make life a little more interesting and challenging for us, we tell it not just to simply turn around, but to do an aerobatic maneuver to turn around, and that maneuver is called an Immelman turn. Does anyone here know what an Immelman turn is? It's invented by the Germans in World War II, I think. So it consists of a half loop followed by a half roll. There you go. And very soon you're flying in the opposite direction. So if you're being annoyed by another jet fighter bothering you in the back and he's shooting at you, one quick way to get out of his way is to do this Immelman turn. And unless the other guy also knows how to do an Immelman turn, he won't be able to catch up with you. So here it just says it's got to do that thing and then come back and land. So here we go. This is now a fully automatic mission, completely automatic, no GPS, nothing. So we're taking off. That's the odometry there, indication saying how far we've traveled. Pretty soon we're going to turn around, I think. Again, the right altitude and the right distance from the airstrip. There we go. That's the half loop, followed by the half roll. And now we're coming back. Those grid lines are not painted on the ground. They're just imaginary lines in our virtual reality depiction. So it's actually not using those to guide itself in any way. So we're coming back to land. You can see people running out of the way. So we are coming back to the airport. There we go, mission accomplished. Now, I was thinking of looking for a good way to conclude this talk, and I was boarding a flight somewhere, and I was walking along the airway, and I noticed this very interesting ad put up by HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, and basically that ad says it all. By the way, these guys are not funding our research. We have no connection with them. Purely coincidence. And look, they've even endowed the bee with a vision system that looks like the vision system we put on our aircraft. So I'd like to thank our funding agencies, many of whom are actually US defense agencies, actually. They're very interested in the kind of work that we're doing because of stealth and compactness and flight. But above all, I'd like to thank our school, which provided these guiding principles that have stayed with me for the rest of my life. Thank you very much.
Good morning. And as the screen is being set up, let me take this opportunity to thank the trustees of the General Thimayya Memorial Trust for having honored me, along with my fellow lecturer, inviting me to be part of this very prestigious and important event. I thank the present trustees, the former trustees, and all those who have made this such a pleasant experience for me. I also want to thank my school, Principal Professor John Zachariah, former Principal Dr. A. Ebenezer, former teachers who are here, especially Mr. Guru Rao, my Kannada teacher, and so many others. Mr. Gowda is here, Mr. Shankar is here, former teachers who were colleagues of my parents, and I want to thank the present Cottonians and my contemporaries, all of whom have graced me and honored me by your presence here. It's a pleasure to be back in Cottons. The world through the prism of science and religion. This is not me as a junior general, but I am wearing the proud khaki. I was one of those who stood at the gate of Bishop Cotton Boys' School in December 1965 as the funeral cortege of General Thimayya passed the school and stopped for a few minutes right across the road. The Reverend I.L. Thomas, in his wheelchair, was at the gate, and the captain of school then crossed the road to place a wreath on the body of General Thimayya, and then they went on to the Hindu burial ground opposite Lal Bagh. In December 1965, I had just completed my first standard, the centenary year, at Bishop Cotton Girls' School, where I studied from KG all the way to Standard 3. Even at that time, the sense of belonging, the sense of history, a sense about what being a Cottonian meant weighed on me and filled me with awe. And so it is that now, so many years later, almost 50 years later, it's a pleasure to come back to this school and honor the memory of General Thimayya. Bishop Cottons has had this incredible ability to shape the imagination. This is what the first 11 looked like when I grew up in a house that no longer exists, near the present mess, and then the photograph you saw with my parents in Elphick Lodge. My father was the first Indian to be invited to teach English at this school, and he served here from 1955 all the way till 1965. My mother, on the other hand, spent her entire career here, teaching from 1960, when she was appointed to the staff by the Reverend I.L. Thomas, till 1993, when she retired when Dr. A. Ebenezer was the principal. Having grown up on this campus, spent the first 7 or 8 years of my life on this campus, again, associative recollection to sing the school song, the level of joy and nostalgia that it brings, that who we are, what we have become, and what you, present Cottonians, will become, this school is going to mark you forever. I cannot outdo Dr. Srinivasan with the kind of visuals that he has shown us. But I decided to go one better. I'm showing you honeymoon photographs. Now, why is it that 3 days after I got married, I take my new bride, Mrinalini, in Kodaikanal to a cemetery? Some of you know that I'm a rather strange person with all kinds of interests. Is this part of my quirkiness that I would take my new bride to a cemetery of all places in Kodaikanal? Well, this is the grave of Canon Elphick. Canon Elphick took a chance way back in 1955 of appointing my father to this school, and that has made all the difference. So in 1987, with my new and only wife, I went to the bazaar of Kodaikanal, and even though I can speak and understand Tamil, having grown up in Bangalore, fairly well, the word cemetery was not in my vocabulary. So I tried all kinds of things like Sattu Poita Manasha, Kalamba. The color, that word which I subsequently found was Tamil for cemetery, was simply not in my vocabulary, not part of my mother tongue, Kannada. But seeing my frantic efforts, somebody pointed me in the correct direction, and sure enough, I found a caretaker there who led us straight to the grave of Canon Elphick. So here I am, standing in the cemetery in Kodaikanal at the grave of a person that I did not know, but who loomed so large in the imagination of my family that my wife had to become part of the long journey that Cottons has meant to me. And the song that came back to memory at that time is the song by Seals and Crofts, an old song, Summer Breeze, blowing through the jasmine in my mind. And for me, the recollection of being a Cottonian is exactly this, jasmine in my mind. You see Canon Elphick in that particular corner. My journey subsequently has led me to strange and wondrous places. I'm a Bangalore boy through and through, but then after studying here and Joseph's and the United Theological College, I really went to my theological teachers. I learned theology not in the United Theological College, but among the village folk of Gauri Bidanur, where I began my pastoral ministry with 5 rural congregations: Yetugadde, Udamalodu, Gangasandra, Kalnaikanahalli, and Tharidal. To be with people who meant so much to me and who, in spite of so many options, choose to be what they were religiously, forced me to look at life and theology and commitment and religion in a way that I had never learned or could learn in a seminary setting. Of course, I then went on to become a faculty member at the United Theological College, studied in Kottayam, Kerala, where my interest in the early church grew and developed, went to Hamburg in Germany for my doctorate, but then I went there via a place I have never seen but would love to, Roman North Africa. My specialization is the emergence of Christianity in the first 3 centuries, not in Europe, but in Roman North Africa. And I'll talk a little about that in a minute. Of course, my journey has then led me to Philadelphia, where I now teach, but it's a journey which constantly and always brings me back to Bangalore, brings me back to Cottons. Some of you saw the slide of my parents long ago, and what you see in the slide is a gift that they got for their wedding. You see, my father had taught here for 1.5 years when he married my mother. They got married in Udupi. And one of the gifts given to the bride and bridegroom is by someone called Mrs. and Mr. B. Karunakar, a wedding gift. And from there, you see in the corner the grave of my parents, buried together in Hosur Road Cemetery. On my mother's grave are the simple words, "When the student is ready, the teacher appears." When she was being buried, on her wedding sari, which she wore in her coffin, Mr. Shankar gave me the Cottonian crest, which was pinned to her sari before she was buried. And so when I stand here, it's definitely with nostalgia, a lifetime of gratitude for what my parents' life together, their contribution to this school, the possibility for me to study here has meant. But let's get back to that wedding gift. Why would somebody in December 1956 give my parents this wedding gift? The book Lights and Shades of Christendom by H. Pakenham Walsh. Of course, my father was housemaster of Pakenham Walsh. I am in Pakenham Walsh. My mother was housemistress of Pakenham Walsh. My son is Pakenham Walsh. My nephew, Mark Samarpan Matthias, is Pakenham Walsh. But isn't it interesting that as a wedding gift in 1956, my parents were given this book, which I still own, Lights and Shades of Christendom. I think it's here that I realized that a British schoolmaster in the Indian context could go on to become the saintly Bishop of Assam and then end his life in an ashram of the Orthodox Church in Coimbatore. The journey of Herbert Pakenham Walsh from the period in which he played a vital role in revitalizing what was very precarious and perilous times for this school, subsequently in leadership positions in Assam, going all the way from India to Assam, and then in the middle slide, a sage, a saint, remembered even today. I think this too shaped my imagination, recognizing that Bishop Cottons opens up people to a multifaceted way of being. The rigorous senior Cambridge curriculum, a desire to serve people of India in as remote a place then as Assam, and then a life of contemplation, looking at the world of religions in India, looking for what best different religions could offer, and ending as a sage and a guru, Herbert Pakenham Walsh. With this interest in what religion could be, my own research focus has been 3rd century Christianity in Roman North Africa. Not terribly exciting, you might think, but I've spent a lot of my life looking at one person, the person whose portrait is found in a Roman catacomb, that is Cyprian of Carthage. Cyprian was from the upper-class Roman society in Carthage, which is a suburb of Tunis in modern-day Tunisia. You see, when people think of the emergence and growth of Christianity in the early centuries, very often they look at Europe, they look at Rome, or they look at Jerusalem. But the reality is, in the first 3 centuries and beyond, the heartbed, the theological center of Christianity was on the other side of the Mediterranean in Roman North Africa. And there in the year 248, a Roman upper-class person called Cyprian decided or was convinced by the fact that this rather motley group of people talking about Jesus was a group whose teachings were worth pursuing. And Cyprian becomes Christian, and in a very short time becomes the bishop of Carthage. He served as a bishop for a brief period of about a decade, and during that period faced tumultuous times. You see, religions then and religions now have never been good or pleasant to each other. Despite all that we talk about the core values of peace and justice and mercy and love, despite all we say about dharma and goodness and care for the neighbor, religions have always clashed. And so it was that 2 Roman emperors, first Emperor Decius in the early 250s, and then Emperor Valerian in 257-258, decided that this growing, even though minority religion, was a threat. And there were deliberate attempts made to stamp out this pernicious heresy called Christianity. People paid for it by having their property taken away. People paid for it by being forced to work as slaves in mines. People paid for it by losing all that they had. But yet, in the face of Roman persecution in the middle of the 3rd century, there were people who decided that life or death, there was a commitment. That even though there was violence from without and violence from within, there could be a sense and purpose in belonging to a particular religion. Does that mean that all other religions are somehow deficient? Not at all, because the Roman worldview seemed to be very accommodative. Those of you who know a little of history know that the Romans welcomed the Egyptian gods. They welcomed the Greek gods. So what was it about Christianity that made the Romans, at the level of the emperors and at the level of the local provinces, including in Roman North Africa, suspicious? It may be a surprise to some people, but Christians were persecuted in the early era because they were considered to be atheists. Why? Well, they said we have respect for who you are, but we tend to be exclusivist. We cannot, in good conscience, accept the pantheon of gods, including the worship of the emperor. Now, not worshiping the emperor was treason, was sedition. This was an irreligious act. This went against all Roman norms and values. And because Christians were considered atheistic, because they refused to worship the emperor, even though they prayed for the emperor in every worship service, they needed to be stamped out. What you see in the corner is the amphitheater of Carthage, where numbers of Christians were martyred in front of merry crowds of women, men, and children who had no compunction in spending a day watching dangerous criminals like Christian women and men being thrown to the animals and killed by gladiators. Cyprian was not killed in this amphitheater in Carthage. He was beheaded on 14 September 258 in the villa of the Roman magistrate. My research has been an attempt to look back, to look at the shape, the formation of what it is that made the Christian religion what it has become, reclaim histories, and find out how that knowledge can enliven us today in a context when we are a minority living alongside our Hindu or Muslim or Parsi and our Buddhist and Jain friends, living in a world of religious pluralism without necessarily resorting to violence, something that this school taught me and something that this school embodies. Here is Roman North Africa. Just take a look at the map, all the way along the coast. Not very far from Europe, as you can see. It's almost touching Spain in the left corner. You can see a bit of the foot of Italy, slightly off-center on the right. You see Sicily, and surrounding all this, at least this surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. You see all these towns and cities. This was the granary of Rome. Rome received huge amounts of grain and oil from two sources, from the port of Carthage and from the port of Alexandria. Carthage, which you see in the right side, the port, which is, as I said, in Tunisia today, these were the places that fed Rome. And this is what it looks like today. Look at the names of the countries: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Sudan. Countries that have been in the news in the 21st century. Is there some connection between these Roman North African provinces and these countries today? So my research is not meant out of some kind of glorifying the past, but trying to see how we can reach back in order to move forward. With all that's happening, with the Arab Spring, with all the tensions, with all the migrations, with all that we hear a little further off in Syria and Turkey, and also all that we hear about Libya and Tunisia and Morocco, there's a great deal of interest in what the past can teach us. The book, on one side, Christianity in Roman Africa, with stunning photographs and visuals. The book on the other side, Early Christianity in Context. And right in the middle is the revised version of my doctoral dissertation, which has a stylized version of the same picture of Cyprian of Carthage that you saw earlier, and it has the Latin title. Not that I wanted to show off that I know a little Latin, though I do, but the title is Baptisma Unum in Sancta Ecclesia, one baptism in the Holy Church, which was what Cyprian was talking about and for which he was prepared to argue and stake a position and develop doctrines that have impact even today. Is baptism a sacrament which brings us out of our natal communities into a separate community? Is baptism something that creates a new identity? Why is it that a sacrament that is supposed to bring people together has succeeded in driving people apart? Who defines what the church is? Who fixes the boundaries? Who are the guardians? What about those who are seen to be outside the boundaries? Is there something about it which affects our life today, which affects our imagination today, which affects the way we see our sisters and brothers from other living faiths and other living traditions? Has that led to a sense of pride and exclusiveness? Do we feel holier and better than thou? What has all this got to do with our identity today? So there's a whole set of research questions that I have been engaged in looking at. There's the whole question of religion and boundaries. You know what I mean, who's in, who's out. There are a lot of religious police on the boundaries, and sometimes there are violent consequences of not being seen as belonging. What are the markers of who is in and who is out? Has religion been used to other the other? Who defines? Why? How? There's a lot to be learned from the early church, and there's a lot to be learned about attitudes and ideologies and theologies today. Are there limits to tolerance and toleration? Is it that we have superficial levels of looking at the other, and up to a point we are okay, but then that streak of intolerance quickly emerges? To what extent do we embody human rights, human dignity, the right of other people to choose? And to what extent are we sort of exclusivistic and more narrow-minded? Are there limits to toleration? The whole question of religion and identity. What makes us who we are? What is the extent to which we can go to prove or to show or to display what it means to belong? Are we prepared to die for our faith? Is it worth dying for our faith? Shouldn't we rather be living for our faith? Cyprian of Carthage was martyred. He was given the choice at his trial before the Roman magistrate to disavow what was called a pernicious superstition. He was asked whether he was prepared to give up. What was it that drove him to say no, that he would hold on to this come what may? When the sentence was pronounced by the judge, the Romans, if anything, were very civilized people. They were very cruel people, but they were very civilized people. Once sentence had been passed, the condemned person had a chance to make a speech. That speech could be an occasion for the person to say why it was that he or she stubbornly clung on to this kind of teaching and doctrine. And Cyprian, as a Roman-trained rhetor, a kind of lawyer, knew that he had this opportunity to make closing remarks. He only said 2 words. Once the sentence of execution was passed, he said, Dio gratia, thank God. So what is it that drives rational people to make this decision or to receive with gratitude the gift of death? What's our attitude to religion and the governing authorities? Why is it that we are so interested in the religious practices and rituals of those who are set in authority over us? What's the role of religion in public life? How does secularism live out in practice within India? In the early church, you have all these negotiations. Religion, what does it mean in terms of authority? Whose authority is paramount? Within 75 years of Cyprian's martyrdom, in the beginning of the 4th century, the then Roman Emperor Constantine reverses 300 years of practice and starts to show favor to the Christians. While research questions the level of his commitment to Christianity, there is no doubt that in a couple of years, that despised religion now becomes the religion of the empire. Did that mean that Christians brought a whole new set of virtues and values to the governance of public life? No. Christians could be as cruel as the cruelty that they experienced being on the other side. And this has been an issue as we look at the long history of colonialism down the ages. A religion which emerges from the fires of martyrdom and persecution becomes to a rather large extent a religion which persecutes other people. So here is another set of research questions. How is it, how can we reclaim an identity which does not come from some kind of triumphalistic attitude, but recover the virtue of humility and simplicity? And of course, my final set of research questions has been about practices and rituals, especially baptism. I must tell you one thing, that as I teach baptism at United Theological College, Bangalore first, and now at Philadelphia, in my class I have all kinds of students from all kinds of backgrounds: Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, Pentecostals, Baptists, Swedes, Mormons, and we have all these very interesting conversations about the practice of rituals within individual denominations. I used to speak about water, running water, cold water, hot water, flowing water, river water, well water. I had a student from Ghana, from an African instituted church, an African independent church. Without a twinge of expression on his face, deadpan, he said, "In Ghana, we have to be very careful that crocodiles don't come and take away the people who are being baptized." I thought that was one of the best things that I had heard about a ritual in the church. I have gone on to write about the past. My second book is entitled Enlivening the Past, an Asian theologian's engagement with the early teachers of faith. Asian Christians have been told, don't worry about the past, just stay with the missionaries, stay with the 18th century, 19th century. What happened in the early church is not yours, you weren't there. Of course, that they didn't take into consideration the fact that Christianity came to India, to Kerala, centuries, if not millennia, before it went to other parts of the world. But be that as it may, with the St. Thomas Christians claiming their legacy from 54 AD, my research has not been out of antiquarian interest. No, this research has been linked with questions of Christianity and religious pluralism in India today. How is it that I grew up and studied in a college? Of course, I recognize that my classmates were from all kinds of backgrounds, but how was it that Bishop Cottons developed in us a sense of respect, self-worth, and human dignity, that differences that religion made in my classmates did not really matter? It was our identity as Indians, as Cottonians, that trumped our identity as belonging to this or that religion. And how was it that I leave this school, leave another fine institution, St. Joseph's College of Arts and Sciences, go to seminary, and then suddenly there, caste identity, regional identity, identity based on ethnicity suddenly becomes important? How is it that my own interest in the past can take me back to what I call more innocent days, more days where human dignity was not defined by what religion one belonged to, but by what values one embodied? And so it is that my experiences at St. Mark's Cathedral, my home parish, in Gauri Bidnur, in many other parishes in Bangalore, and as a teacher at the United Theological College, have forced me to confront the deeper questions of pluralism, identity, belonging, secularism, and its peculiar manifestation in India today. Stanley Samartha, the pioneer of interfaith understanding, who did so much to foster interreligious cooperation, said something which I believe has something also to do with science, and that is, pluralism does not relativize truth. It relativizes different responses to truth. Pluralism does not relativize truth. It relativizes different responses to truth. Stanley Samartha in the early 1960s preached at the St. Peter's Tide celebration at the St. Peter's Chapel, and in the 90s several times, both in the boys' school and the girls' school. To conclude, I have a set of questions whereby I address the interface between faith, science, and religion. Scientia, the pure objective study of phenomena, so brilliantly demonstrated by Dr. Srinivasan. Sapientia, the way of wisdom, asking questions about human existence. Is there a way that they interface with one another? Are there different and separate domains, the world of science and the world of religion, which have their own set of interests? Is there a duel between science and religion? Or can we talk more about a duet? Is there always competition and conflict between science and religion? Is there mutually exclusive attitudes and an exclusionary attitude? Or can there be an embrace between faith and science? I have 3 quotations and then I will conclude. My first quotation comes from Stephen Jay Gould, the late brilliant popularizer of science. And in his book he writes, if religion can no longer dictate the nature of factual conclusions residing properly within the magisterium of science, then scientists cannot claim higher insight into moral truth from any superior knowledge of the world's empirical constitution. So Gould goes on to say, this mutual humility between faith and science, which have their own clear magisteria, leads to important practical consequences in a world of such diverse passions. The second quotation comes from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who draws from another great North African theologian, Augustine of Hippo. And Rowan Williams, in his book on Augustine, writes, scientia is practical knowledge. You saw that brilliantly demonstrated in the experiments and in the visuals by the previous speaker. Knowing how to do things, how to find your way around a world of objects and negotiate them successfully. It is oriented to being useful. Sapientia is wisdom directed towards immaterial reality, towards what can only be looked at and delighted in for its own sake, not used. Scientia and sapientia. I'm not saying that scientists cannot have sapientia or that those who claim the way of ethical values cannot have scientific rigor. But it's useful to see some of these broader perspectives when we talk about faith and science. And then Robert Bellah, who's one of the most prominent sociologists of religion who died recently. His last major book is called Religion in Human Evolution. He writes, if we could see that we are all in this, with our theories, yes, but with our practices and stories together, even though we must contend through mutual discussion with abiding differences. Yeah, there are differences, yet we might make just a bit more likely the actualization of a world civil society that could at least restrain the violence of state-organized societies towards each other and the environment. Can religion and science work together towards restraining the violence present in our world today? Violence against other human beings, violence against the world of nature, violence against the environment. And so it was, and so it is, and so it will be that Cotton, on straight on. It's fascinating that we have the statue of Bishop Cotton sitting right outside this auditorium. Some of you know and have heard that on a trip to the upper reaches of Assam, when his barge parked in the middle of the Brahmaputra, or was it the Hooghly, he tried to cross in fading daylight, wearing his robes, slipped and fell, and his body was never found. But yet, something that he saw about a well-rounded education, about people who needed to recognize that the purpose of education was to draw out from what seems to be narrow and constrained, to draw out from this values that would be broader, higher, richer, all-encompassing, values that would lead us to continue to go on, straight on, without trying to prove one over against the other, one attitude, one perspective, but that we together could go forward. On straight on is undoubtedly a military metaphor. But can we today also see it as a metaphor of recognizing that our journey, or journeys, as scientists, as theologians, as rational people, as people of faith, as people who have no time or interest in religious questions, that all of us, we are on this journey, which is an ongoing journey, where we commit ourselves to working together, respecting one another, forming communities of peace and reconciliation, and embodying the best of what Cotton's has and continues to offer a robust, well-rounded, and sensitive education where together we may pursue truth wherever she may be found. Thank you very much.
Get in your hot seats now. I wonder, before we open up, whether each of you has a question for the other.
Srini, obviously there's such a joy and delight in what you do and this incredible passion along with your team of pursuing your particular research interests. How do you deal with the fact that, given the funding that you have, commercial interests, that this joyful research, if I may so put it, is used for certain purposes with which you may or may not agree?
No, that is a very good question, JAYAKIRAN, and it's something that worries us all the time when we accept funding from, especially from defense-related organizations. Somehow, in my particular situation, I've never actively sought funding from defense organizations. In fact, defense have somehow found out about our work, maybe through conferences and publications, and tapped us on our shoulder and said, hey, would you like to look at this? And initially, I had some trepidations about that, but I find that, especially the United States, contrary to what many people may think or suspect, quite often they're very interested in basic research for its own sake. For example, they never stopped us from publishing our work, and they encouraged us. And some of the questions were actually very simple. For example, they're trying to see whether they could use bees as sort of sentinels, as sort of like a canary in a coal mine, to see if there's any toxic nerve gas in a particular area. Looking at the behavior of bees, when you set up a beehive there, by looking at their behavior, you can tell whether the atmosphere there is contaminated or poisoned in some way. So a lot of these things are actually for the good, I believe. And quite often, even basic research organizations will not fund some of the very basic research that the Defense Department seem to be funding. And the other thing is, maybe our research has not been that exciting for them. If it was really exciting, they'd probably stopped us from doing that. You cannot publish this. We're going to use this. It's you know, intellectual property is ours now, and we won't let you continue. So that's the story. Yeah, yeah. So could I? Yeah, but my turn was okay. Some time ago, I think there was an attempt to get a universal language. I think it was called Esperanto. And I'm not sure how well it has succeeded, but can one think of maybe trying to manufacture a single universal religion? If it's possible, that would be fantastic.
There have been attempts down the years, obviously, to think about whether human beings can accept a certain set of attitudes and values. But the reality is, while attitudes and values exist across the religions, given the historical nature from where different religions emerged, and given the intricate complexity that each religion embodies, and the way historically a religion has split into so many groups and sects and embraced so many ideologies, it's unlikely that an experiment like that will succeed. And this is not for lack of trying. Sri Aurobindo and the mother in Pondicherry, that was the hope for a universal kind of religion, a great experiment, and people should continue to draw from it and learn from it. But without that, how can we still live together in peace and harmony?
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a question for you. Has the law as a discipline kept up with your respective professions? Do you find it lagging behind, or is it ahead in some ways in terms of the research and the work that you do?
The law in general, right? It's fascinating. One of the theories, one of the new approaches, one of the important cultural studies shaping of the framework has been what we call post-colonial theory. And that has proved to be very influential in interrogating who we are, where we come from, where we are going. And it's fascinating that 70 years after independence, more or less, the fact that in India, we inherited this set of laws which come from a particular Victorian sensibility, especially in matters regarding sexuality and intra-human behavior, a particular attitude to discipline and punish, a particular attitude to the understanding of the citizen, and a particular way in which the British authorities then sought to protect individual rights within religions, that 70 years later we are still wrestling with this. It's interesting that India had the chance to write a brand new constitution. Ambedkar, of course, plays a major role as the first law minister. The fact that he had studied at Columbia in New York and had also been at Oxford, a remarkable document, the Constitution of India. But when you come into the existing laws, the long legacy of Victorian England lies heavy on us even today. And how can we, in a post-colonial situation, take cognizance of that, recognize that, and redefine certain things given the changes that are happening all over the world?
Yes, in my case, it's a little more specific, I guess. And so 2 areas I can think of. For example, in the case of autonomous aerial vehicles and drones, there's more and more rules being clamped down on everybody regarding the size and weight of the drones that one can fly. Even though we test fly our aircraft in very restricted, what we consider to be safe environments, the law does come down on us. And I think it's probably for good reason. These drones are likely to be misused for several purposes. They can be used to spy on areas which you're not allowed to do, violation of privacy. They're concerned about drones being able to now carry weapons and shoot. They've got video cameras, they've got guns, and the sky's the limit, as they say. But the other place where I'm really happy that the law is coming down on us is in the animal behavior side, where animal ethics is becoming more and more of a governing force in telling us what we can do with our experiments and what we cannot. And part of what I suppose my next sort of foray is really into looking at, for example, whether simple creatures even feel pain. So we're doing experiments now to try and see if we can understand whether honeybees or lowly creatures like that even have some perception of something that resembles pain. I don't know how it'll work out. It's a very controversial subject. But if it does, then it's important to make sure that even lowly creatures, I'm probably realizing now that these creatures are not as lowly as we think them to be, right? They're wonderful creatures with a sentience. And if the law comes down on the way we treat these animals, no matter how low they are, I would be very happy.
Thank you very much. The house is open now. My colleagues will go around with counters, and whoever picks one can ask their question. The customary request to keep your question as short as possible. You can otherwise expect a rather impolite intervention from me. And I do hope the boys and girls will have some questions too.
My first question, it may not be a question, for Professor Srinivasan, that I move around with a lot of scientists in India. They measure their achievements in terms of terms of the number of papers they have written. But I'm so proud and happy to see you are producing something on the ground. How far are you away from Nobel Prize?
That's a good question.
My question to Reverend Dr. Sebastian is also not a question. Having heard you and considering the condition in India today, I think with like-minded religious and other leaders, you should undertake a padayatra all over India, start it from your school and ending up in J&K. What do you think of it, sir?
Well, in one sense, the Padayatra has already started because every single Cottonian who passes out of this institution, wherever he or she, Bishop Cotton Boys' School, Bishop Cotton Girls' School, my sincere hope is that each and every one of them is carrying that conviction that we are in it together wherever they are placed, whether in India or abroad. So I believe that Cottonians are engaged in a Padayatra of peace and harmony.
But this is, doesn't answer my question. You are passing the responsibility to youngster who is as yet to start.
That's true.
My humble request to you that if possible,
Yes.
you had that Padayatra today.
Thank
from
you.
Cotton School. Thank you, sir.
No, I appreciate that very much. Thank you. And again, I need to acknowledge with a deep sense of gratitude that my individual Padayatra started in the villages of Gauri Bidanur, and I'll forever be grateful to those who accompanied me on that journey. And that's where it began, and that's where it will continue from. But I would love to hear Dr. Srinivasan talk about yet another honor that I believe should be his at some stage.
Wing Commander Butt, my eldest brother was Dr. Srinivasan's classmate, and the Reverend's father taught me English, so hope I'm speaking good English. Well, Doctor, my question is for you first, in the sense that this technology that you spoke about so well is magnificent, to say the least. And I recollect seeing some movie where a small bee comes and spies on this terrorist things. Now, I would like to know, now if you pass it on to me, you'll probably be hung as a spy, but how does the Indian Air Force get your technology? How do we go about it?
So your question, if I understand correctly, was how did the Air Force take advantage of this?
How does the Indian Air Force...
How does the Indian Air Force get a hold of your technology? Join the bandwagon.
Well, it's all in the public domain. All of our work has been published. There's very little that's really classified or kept secret. So, you know, it's all in the publications, and I'm very happy to provide you with more details of the algorithms and so on. So it's all completely open.
I appreciate that. I'll pass it on to the Air Force. And Dr. The Reverend...
They may just have to pay me a little bit, but that's okay. I'm only joking.
I can't ask you anything because, you know, the reverence of the Lord and the way you spoke, there's really nothing left to ask you about.
Then maybe we should move to the next question.
Thanks, Aditya, for having me over, like always for the last many years. I didn't go to this school. I went to that pesky school up the road. 2 questions, one for Reverend.
Come on, that goes against everything that I said. Yeah?
Reverend, you talked about othering the other and the understanding today from your perspective, Christianity, on the other. What would your reaction be to this apparent clash of civilizations, if you want to call it that, that's occurring in the context of migration in Europe, seen most poignantly in the body of that poor child lying on the beach? That's my question to you and to Dr. Srini. In all of this technological advancement, where you're going to be using such inputs to potentially reduce the element of the human mind, how do you accommodate for the superior, if you want to call it that, human ability to react to situations, especially in the kind of technology that's going to be used in aircraft? Isn't a reliance on technology going to subvert potentially things like safety? Where's the trade-off between the two? Thank you.
Very briefly, I think you hit upon two very interesting things. One is, of course, othering the other, and the other is the limits of toleration and tolerance. When numbers were small in the so-called migrant communities, there was a very high degree of openness to assimilation and this and that. When numbers cross a certain threshold, there's a certain reaction which people all over the world have to reckon with. If the current trends hold, in 2030, the United States will be majority Hispanic. Of course, the category Hispanic is such a broad category and is all-encompassing. So again, which language? Is it going to be English? Is it going to be Spanish? So it raises a whole set of questions as to up to which point are people comfortable, and when does discomfort tend to creep in? Humanitarian issues, yes, but space, and suddenly you get the protectionism, which we have experienced in the recent elections too. And again, pressing questions of our times.
Thank you, thank you. So that's a very good question there that you posed over there. There is an increasing trend towards, what I talked about was just very low-level vision and navigation, not bumping into obstacles, making smooth landings and so on, flying down a narrow passage. But the next level, especially in a battlefield situation, they talk about situational awareness. So knowing what is going on, where the enemy is, what the enemy is plotting, how can you deal with it, that's something they're trying to put into these systems now through learning networks, artificial intelligence networks that can be trained to recognize various patterns of behavior, recognize the intent of a person, for example, who might be plotting something. So these systems are becoming more and more intelligent, and there is a danger. I mean, as you know, Stephen Hawking some time ago really warned that we should keep an eye on these very intelligent machines and the way this thing is going, because pretty soon you may not be able to turn off the switch when they start to behave improperly. But at the same time, they're building in machines that also can do, or try to do, fairly ethical considerations. For example, should I try and, if you have a limited option and say, should I try and save a busload of people, 50 people, from dying by sacrificing one other pedestrian, because I can have a choice of either saving this one pedestrian or 50 people in the bus. What do I do, right? Those kinds of ethical considerations are also being built into these machines.
Thank you. My question actually follows from the other question from the school across the road, but it's better than that one. The question is, when things are becoming more automated, what is the role of human intuition? And to Reverend Sebastian, how does religion define relationship with such technology? Or how do we define a relationship with such machines, where we are involved with and then increasingly not involved with them?
So the way I see it is that I think the human role will be relegated to a higher and higher level of, what would you call it, command. So you don't micromanage the system. You tell it simply, I want you to get from A to B. I don't care how you do it. Just do it the way you think best. So this higher level authority and freeing the person from doing the very low level sort of tasks is where I think this will start to happen. And the problem with that, of course, that ultimately, if machines somehow decide to get a mind of their own and do what they want, you have to be able to override what they want to do, and that's the problem.
Appreciate your question, because I think you've also touched upon deeper ethical questions. It's not just the question of human beings and machines and non-sentient beings. Who would have thought that sand, silica in sand, would have such a huge impact on technology in the 20th and now 21st century? Silica was there, sand was there, and something dramatically different happens, and it's so crucial for nearly everything that we are involved in. So similarly, to look at religion as a simplistic form of providing a guidebook, textbook approach, is that enough for the complexities and messiness of the 21st century? There are questions that come up from our present human existence and interconnectedness, which were not questions of the past. Nevertheless, can insights from the past still have value for the present? Even in a context where religions emerged, where, let us say, there were no machines, even in a context, say, where LGBT rights were not an issue, or same-sex marriage, or abortion, or all the ethical issues that divide us today and beyond, can religion still provide us a way of thinking about certain things and deeper values that transcend the immediacy and poignancy of a particular issue? So, sentient machines that you are talking about, the ability of an algorithm to predict certain behavioral patterns without human intervention, but then call for human intervention, a whole set of ethical questions. Can we claim that religion has nothing to say about it, or can we still continue to draw from that? Thank you for that question.
5, please.
Can I just...
Who has 5? Yeah.
Wonder if I could add...
sorry.
I just want to add one more brief comment to that thing. Thank you. So there's an increasing push to make these robots more humanoid as well. And that increases their acceptance in society. And there was a wonderful demonstration or experience some time ago in Japan where they had this robot, a humanoid robot, which was taken to a school. And the school children basically got aggressive towards it because they thought it was fun to interact with the robot in that way. And they eventually broke off its arm. And the next step was to try and see, well, can you build a stronger machine that will withstand, tearing and pulling apart like that? But no, that didn't work. What they found out ultimately worked was they actually made the robot cry if someone actually wanted to come and do damage to it. And that had immediately the desired response. The kids stepped back and treated with a lot more respect and empathy. Yeah, exactly. So to make a robot sort of, produce empathy is pretty the next frontier, I think. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. That was great. Dr. Shastri.
Two little questions. One is very simple. The other one has a theological, philosophical component. The first thing is, why did you refer to bees as she on some occasions? One. The second thing again comes from Dr. Srinivasan's talk, and you did at the end give a disclaimer. You several times, 5 or 6 times, you did refer to lower animals. This whole business of lower animals, I think, stems from the idea that God made man in his image. Therefore, God has 2 arms, 2 eyes, stuff like that. And the other animals are lower animals. And if I may say so, science, which came out of the church, has taken this up and say, we want to rule the world. We must rule the world. We must fly. We must, control the weather. So there is a connection. And there are some areas where theology is right and science is going in the wrong direction.
No, thank you very much for those 2 questions. In answer to your first question, In answer to your first question, the reason why I refer to the bees as she is because it's only the females that go out and forage and collect food, so it's part of their lifestyle. They work very hard. The only mission of a female bee is to actually collect food. You know, it's amazing. The males, which are called drones, have only one thing on their minds, and it's not hard work or foraging. I'll leave it to you to guess what it is. So really, it is entirely, all the knowledge about bees is based entirely on females. To answer your second question, every time I say low, I should have, opened my, sort of put up my arms and said in quotes. It may say that in quotations, because I certainly don't consider them to be lower animals. But that's the common percept, you see. Everybody thinks of invertebrates as being just lowly creatures. And part of our research is to really try and see how, they're not that lowly. They really are capable of doing these wonderful things that we're discovering, right? For example, to go back to the subject of pain, if you jab a human being or a dog or a cat, you poke and it flinches, right? And you're convinced that it experiences pain. But if you jab an insect and it does the same thing, you say, oh, that cannot be pain. It must just be some simple reflex. And this is what we're trying to test now to see if that's really the case, or are they really feeling pain? I mean, I share your opinion entirely. I think these creatures don't deserve to be treated badly at all. I mean, they have a life of their own, and we have no right to take that life. And even when we do experiments, we've got to be very careful how we treat them. So I'm hoping our research will actually elevate our attitude towards this work. And certainly, when I say lowly, I don't mean, it's not my opinion. It's the general public opinion which I'm trying to sort of convey. Thank you.
6, please.
My name is Vasanthi Hariprakash, and I'm very delighted to discover that even among the bees, the hardworking gender is which one. I'm happy to belong there. Well, some things are so similar across the animal kingdom. Fascinating talk. Thank you so much, both of you. Dr. Srinivasan, my first question, I happen to be an independent media person. You are such an inspiration for someone who had who's an electrical engineer and then decided to turn your gaze on the bees. And a career switch in many ways. Have you or your university ever considered, or you've already done, an outreach to younger people to, spread these findings and actually tell them that such a thing exists? I mean, I didn't even know of the word biorobotics till I actually came here. So, what do you do really to have these shared among the young people, particularly in India, where you're so stuck on BE and MBBS, even in this age, though there's a lot changing. My question to you, Reverend, is what is your take on America in the next few years under Trump?
I was certainly one of those who sat in front of the TV, even though I'm an Indian citizen and cannot vote. I was certainly one of those who sat in front of the TV and at 11 o'clock that night realized that things were not going the way that I thought it would. It's fascinating at multiple levels. Quick comments. How interesting it is that American presidential candidates have to be seen to be religious, and how interesting it is that there's this strong group of so-called evangelical Christians who take a stand based not on values which theoretically should emerge from religion, but based on certain personalities and choices. So a couple of things. Trump claims that he's Presbyterian. He has now been seen going to church, and I don't know if he carries a Bible. I don't know if he carries a Bible with him. All kinds of interesting signals. Nikki Haley has been named ambassador to the United Nations. But it is really anxiety-producing for a lot of people. If a society is founded on care for the vulnerable, if on the Statue of Liberty the words are carved, "Give me your poor, huddled masses," if a country has been built on immigration, and if immigration is the hallmark of what makes the United States the United States, attack on that is going to cause a level of disruption, I believe, and it's up to civil society and people of goodwill everywhere to recognize that ultimately a society is judged by what it does to the weak and the vulnerable.
So my take on that is slightly different. I think Trump has surrounded himself with a lot of lovely, good-looking young women who will be very hardworking and do the right thing. but to address your question, yes, I take every opportunity to reach out and talk to schools about my career. But I must say that I have a bit of trepidation about, I literally followed my heart. And these things that happened throughout my career were just more or less accidents, you know. It wasn't really planned. So when I was doing my master's at the Indian Institute of Science in electrical and electronic engineering, for my master's thesis, my professor said, hey, instead of doing a fairly straightforward control systems analysis of some machine, why don't you do something biological? Look to see how the human eye tracks a moving target, model that as a servo mechanism. Sounded interesting, got into it. And that's how my launch into biology happened. It was purely by chance. And you know, in those days, we didn't think about our career so carefully. We followed our heart. Now, I don't know if that's good advice to give to a young person. I was lucky that way, you know. Quite often my students, when they come to my lab looking for a project and I suggest something, they're much more career-oriented. They say, look, can I get a publication out of this? Can I get a publication in a high-impact journal? If so, if not, I'm not interested. Regardless of how interesting the question is that you're trying to pose, right? So people are much more practical now, and maybe that's a good way to go because it's a very competitive society these days. So although I would like to advise them, you know, dearly to say, okay, try and do what I did, I hope I'm not doing a disservice when I do that. So it's a real problem. I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
7, please. Yes, ma'am. No, I think the one, yes, Commodore. To the folks who haven't picked a counter yet, you'll please have to wait your turn.
My first question is to Dr. Srinivasan. You had mentioned that the bees have got a substitute mechanism which can enable them to do away with the GPS, sort of. Do the bees also have anything to do away with the inertial navigation system, which is the used in all cruise missiles, etc.? My second to Dr. Sebastian. During evening vespers in the chapel here, we used to hear a simple phrase. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. I would like to have your comments, seeing the present situation in the world today. Is the rough hew becoming tolerable or intolerable? Thank you.
Should I go for it? So in answer to your question about inertial navigation systems, bees, it's not yet completely investigated, but in certain other flying insects like flies, which really have, what happens in flies is that the two front wings are the real wings, but the two hind wings have degenerated into small oscillating sort of sticks like this, and people think they function like a gyroscope. So that could be one part of an inertial navigation system that insect could also use. It's not been studied very carefully yet, but that's one possibility. And of course, a number of insects use the sky as a compass. So to get the flight direction, they use the position of the sun, because the sun changes its position during the day, but they have a built-in clock to account for that. And so they use that as a compass. Even if the sun is hidden behind a compass, behind a cloud, if there's a certain patch of the sky that's blue, they can use the pattern of polarization that the sun produces in the sky as a surrogate for the sun and use that pattern as a compass. So they got direction information and the flight distance information that's based on the optic flow, the image motion, as I mentioned to you, the odometer, and they combine those to navigate. Entirely self-contained without any external information.
Your question relates also to an earlier one on human beings being in the image of God. And it's so fascinating that ancient Indian wisdom, and this from Shankaracharya in Brahma Sutra Bhashya 112, in Sanskrit it says, Atato Brahma Jignasa. And then, therefore, the inquiry into Brahman. Before the inquiry into divinity begins, there's a whole set of things that have to happen before indeed the depth of divinity is rediscovered. And this covers the fact that unless there are criteria by which we recognize human beings to be human, any exploration into the depths of the divine is not going to succeed. So there's much to be said in ancient Indian wisdom that we need to rediscover in a world of multiple faiths.
Thank you. Dr. Srinivasan, you kind of downplayed the military importance of the work you do, but it's apparent that there is a huge military implication. One is for stealth technology. The other is applications like cruise missiles, autonomous carriers, unmanned combat systems, etc. Has it already found way, what you work about, has it already found way into this military technology? And secondly, does it require newer ways of propulsion, or is what's available right now, the propulsion technology available, suitable enough to incorporate the kind of technology you talk about? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So the optic flow principles are becoming more and more recognized and used in a variety of systems. The challenge now is the miniaturization. There's a group at Harvard, we're not experts in that, but this group at Harvard is building very tiny flapping wing insects about the size of a honeybee that can take off on their own. They're putting vision sensors on them, which will hopefully guide them to wherever they need to go. That's happening. There's a fair amount of interest in this may be useful in military as well as civilian applications. Pursuing somebody or pursuing a target without giving away your own presence or your own motion. We've been studying the way in which aggressive, angry honeybees track moving targets. It's very interesting. You have to put on a bee suit when you study these things. But they approach a target not just directly, but in a way that does not give away their own motion. So that stealthy operation is actually good, not just for defense purposes, but also for example, wildlife observation, where you want to observe an animal without disturbing it. Or you want to, for example, telecast some sporting event without disturbing the people who are actually playing the event. So there's lots of peaceful applications too, which are becoming more and more sort of used, I would say.
Serial number 9, please.
So my question is to Dr. Srinivasan. It's kind of a two-part question, really. The first part is related to the landing of bees. So you said that when a bee approaches a target, it selects its target by keeping the image velocity constant. So what would happen if the bee was to land on a dynamic target which had dynamic image velocity? And the second part is, given the fact that there's a lot of research being conducted into phantom limbs, do bees also get affected by phantom limbs, and do they affect the wings of the bees as well? So these are the two questions.
I didn't catch that second question. Did bee get affected by?
Phantom limbs, so amputated limbs.
Phantom limbs. Oh, you should ask Ramachandran that question. I'll come to your first question. Yes, we have looked at how they land on a dynamic target. I didn't have a chance to describe that to you. So what we did was we looked at it's hard to move a target that's on the ground. I suppose you could, but it's a little tricky. What we did was to look at bees landing on a vertical surface like this. And you find, again, what they're doing is as they approach the surface, they're keeping the total image velocity constant. So when you approach the surface towards it perpendicularly, you see a pattern of expansion. The surface appears to expand as you get closer and closer to it, right? And they're keeping the rate of expansion constant as they come in, so they automatically, again, slow down. Just as the way they land on the horizontal surface, they progressively slow down as they land on the vertical surface. But the nice thing about the vertical surface is that you can now manipulate the apparent expansion that they see by making them land on a pattern that looks like a spiral. You can then spin the spiral one way or the other. If you spin it one way, you appear to make it expand. And when you do that, the bees hit the brakes and come in a lot more slowly, because you see a lot of expansion. Right? When you spin it the other way, the bee, it contracts, and then the bees get sucked in, they come in very fast. So we're not just having fun fooling bees with this experiment. This tells us that the critical cue that they're using is just the image expansion. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, with the second thing, the phantom limbs, that's a very interesting area of research. So that just be looked at. Yeah, we don't know. We really don't know.
Thanks so much.
Serial number 10, please.
Hi. My question is to both of you. So I've been working a little with civil society to try to change my neighbor's behavior towards garbage separation, and traffic safety. We have like 400 Indians dying on our roads every day, or there are a lot of people dying on our roads. So, but when I speak to people, mostly it's like there's a lot of pushback that, no, this is where we want to park, or this is the way we want to drive, and we've always kept our garbage together, and who are you to come and tell us? Oh, yeah. And the government says that they're too busy with the big players, with the commercial people, to bother about small flats and small houses, and they want the RWS to do it. So my question is that in your own lives, if you've had this kind of resistance and inertia, and what you did to convince people. Thank you.
Definitely religion has had this tendency to reify things and concretize certain attitudes. But the reality is, if certain things have been learned, certain things can be unlearned. And the trajectories within a religious tradition constantly teach us that the tablets of stone on which certain attitudes are bound can become an idol, in the sense that that becomes the once for all. But I believe that within the whole system of understanding the dynamism, that which has been seen as normal and normative can constantly be challenged by people like yourself, where you look at broader themes, things that have not been considered, and force people to rethink cherished positions. It's not an easy task, but it's a task worth doing, and definitely in terms of certain human rights in which I've been involved, to my surprise and joy, people can change.
So I'm thinking of a more, what would you call it, down-to-earth solution to the picking up the garbage. If I understood the question correctly. These garbage trucks now are becoming more and more automated. We find that, although there's a human operator who comes and sort of controls the picking up of the garbage bins, that actual arm is actually being controlled in a remote fashion by the driver himself. So it won't be long before maybe we'll have self-driving trucks that will automatically pick up all of these things. And also, if that truck has another truck, an accident with another truck, there's no human beings involved. So accidents may happen, but no one gets killed. So that may be one way of trying to, solve this problem. Again, multiple traffic, that's a problem if human beings are sitting inside the cars. Self-driving cars may not be the safest thing in the world. We have to develop that. It's still lots of questions about that. But at least for these service vehicles, where you don't, in principle, don't need a person to be there, you can probably minimize the danger of accidents. Even planes, for example, I feel now, the technology has come to the point where commercial airlines, you don't really need a pilot on the plane anymore. I mean, even if you have a human pilot, the pilot can sit at home in his or her lounge chair, take off the plane automatically. The remote control is very good these days. You fly them across the Pacific or whatever under GPS navigation. The pilot doesn't have to do anything. You just have a cup of coffee. He can take off several planes, one after the other. They can fly. And then he can manually, well, through remote control, land each one of them. See, the pilot does not want to go from A to B. You don't want him to get jet lagged. I mean, why should he go on the plane, right? It's the passengers who want to go from A to B. Really, I mean, when you think about it. And also, this sounds a bit callous, but you spent millions of dollars training a pilot, right? You don't want to lose him in an air crash. He's valuable. So it's the passengers that need to go from A to B, and they have to have trust in the automated system. Thank you.
Yeah, we had made provision for 10 questions, but with your liberty, may we take 2 from the boys, please?
Sure.
Yeah, the 2 boys at the back.
So I have a question for Dr. Srinivasan. I have 2 questions. First question is, how efficient will this biotechnology be in high-speed machines, the ones which bees use for balancing themselves and getting through small areas? And my second question is, can something as big as few kilometer squares be balanced by imaging the horizon the ways bees do it?
Okay, to address your first question, it is a challenge. We still don't know how to build energy-efficient small machines that will fly long distances. But, you know, insects provide an existence proof, as you might say. Someone calculated that a honeybee can travel around the world using 2 tablespoons of honey. So that is extremely efficient, and we still don't know exactly how to do that in the engineering sense. That's where we have to understand more about the biology and copy the biology maybe. That's something we really don't know. That's a challenge for us, but I think we'll eventually have to do it because we know that, you know, there are other animals that do it. So eventually, it's a matter of time, I think, before we discover how they do it and put that into our things. The other question, when you're flying high above the sky, is that what you were saying?
No, sir. I'm talking about when it's even moving on the surface or something. Even if it's moving on the surface or flying any of the ways. I want to just ask if the horizon imaging system can, what the bees use, can be used to balance a thing which is as big as a few kilometers.
Oh, so, yeah, so the horizon balancing system will work with big aircraft too. The only constraint there, problem comes when you're not flying high above the ground. Let's say you're flying in an environment where on one side you just have a very flat terrain, on the other side you have some cliff or a tall building. Then the horizon will not be flat, and this aircraft will be fooled into thinking it's something banking like this, right? That's the thing you have to avoid, and that's a challenge. And curiously enough, insects don't suffer from that problem. Even though they are known to use their eyes to balance the horizon this way, they will fly completely flat in a situation where you have a cliff on one side and an empty ocean on the other side. And exactly how they do that is still a mystery, unsolved mystery.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So, excuse me, sir.
You'll have to leave it there, please. Is there any other boy? Yeah, there was one boy who had a question, and we'd like to give the girls a chance after that and then call it a day.
My question is for Mr. JAYAKIRAN. So you touched a little bit on religious freedom, that just because a person follows a particular faith, the appropriateness of any other faith would be negated. But so where would you place a limit on the free practice of religion before you get extremism, like in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, the Islamic State, and the Shiv Sena?
Thanks for raising that. It's a cluster of a whole set of questions. When religions become exclusive and are seen, and particular ideologies and movements and persons and attitudes are seen as having religious sanctions, including the use of texts from the religious scriptures to justify certain things, then we need to ask if we have indeed moved beyond an attitude where all of us are seen as having worth. There's a phrase in Kannada, Devaru mukha nodi mane hakuvudilla. God does not look at your face before deciding what you ought to be served. If God indeed shows no partiality, how have these pernicious ideologies emerged where certain people are seen as being subhuman or not sufficiently human or being the other? Even within those religious traditions, while there is freedom, while all this happens, should my freedom be at the cost of disparaging and dehumanizing the other? Constant challenge all the time. You don't have to go to the extreme groups. We have to look within also.
This is to Reverend Dr. Sebastian. The more we evolve, the more knowledgeable we become in terms of intellectuality. Do you think we become intolerant towards other people, religions, and opinion?
I think built into the human psyche for whatever reason is the my principle, nanu nammavaru, the my principle. And I think religion constantly strives to bring us out of ourselves, out of that attitude, towards the we, the us, the together. And how can, I mean, the challenge constantly is we are sort of hardwired to maximize our own potential, our own pleasure, but should it be at the cost of the others? How can we be in it together? And I suppose that's the joy of belonging to a particular class, to belonging to a particular school, where the individual is subordinated to the greater good of all, which is what Cottons embodies.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll let you resume your seats now. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of appreciation for our speakers. Profuse apologies to those who had questions, but we couldn't accommodate for want of time. But I'm sure you'd like to keep the conversation going with both Dr. Srinivasan and Reverend Sebastian. They're public individuals. Their email IDs are on the web, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to stay in touch. Could we at this point ask Mrs. Mirai Chengappa, please, to felicitate our speakers? Ma'am. Dr. Srinivasan first, please, if you could. We'll do it here. We'll do it here. May I also request Kiran, please? We take a moment to recognize our patrons. Admiral Shekhawat, who's in Jaipur, couldn't be with us today, but sends us his best. Lieutenant General Jaitley is here. Could I please request our former trustee, Kiran Lakhani, to present a bouquet to General Jaitley? Thank you, Kiran. Thank you also, Mrs. Jaitley, for being with us. Air Marshal Osman, could I ask another former colleague of ours, Jayraj Daniel, please, to present the Air Marshal with a bouquet. Thank you, Jayraj. Thank you, Mrs. Osman, for being with us. We want to take a moment to thank our former colleagues, Kiran and Jayraj. They've worked with us selflessly and they've got themselves a well-deserved break. Maybe some of us should follow suit. We take a moment to especially remember our past patron, Air Marshal Mally Wallen. We miss him sorely. We would like to felicitate our principal, Professor John Zachariah. May I, on behalf of the trustees, ask Ms. Jennifer Daubeny, please, the Consul General for Canada, who's with us, to present the principal with the bouquet. Thank you, Ms. Daubeny. And thank you, Principal, for your continued support. I would like to recognize our old boy, Kashi Bobby Rao, who's responsible for Ms. Daubeny's presence along with other distinguished guests. And he's in fact, Bobby, would you please stand up and be recognized? Bobby was instrumental in the Canadian Prime Minister visiting Cottons a year or two ago. I believe Donald Trump is next. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to remember friends who've passed by this year. May I please request you to stand as we remember those who've passed us by.
Please remain standing
for the national anthem.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you next year.